The steel dragons of the Pacific met their doom in a heartbeat. Fire consumed 3 Japanese carriers in moments that felt like eternity. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu transformed into floating pyres. The shock ripples through history even today. Superior firepower didn't win this battle. Perfect timing did. Brutal sacrifice did. One catastrophic error left the Empire naked before its enemies. How does a naval superpower crumble in the space of a breath? The story will transform your understanding of the Pacific War forever. That morning of June 4, 1942, brought crystalline skies over endless blue water. Beneath that deceptive calm, floating fortresses rushed toward their fiery graves. Across Akagi's flight deck, Japanese sailors moved in desperate choreography. Ordnance lay everywhere like scattered death. Bombs waited. Torpedoes gleamed. Fuel lines snaked between aircraft like veins pumping lifeblood. Aviation gasoline perfumed the salt air with its deadly sweetness. Motors thundered. Propeller blades carved the morning breeze. Victory felt minutes away. America's carriers would soon taste annihilation. Then the horizon birthed tiny shadows against morning light. Dauntless dive bombers materialized like hunting hawks, silent at first, then screaming earthward with death in their talons. Spotters jabbed fingers skyward. Voices broke with terror. Commands exploded across the bridge. Too late. Japanese fighters were already gone, chasing phantom torpedo squadrons at wave height. Drawn away by doomed American crews who flew straight into slaughter. Nothing protected the carrier decks now. 10:26 a.m. brought the first impact. Thunder split the morning air apart. Akagi bucked like a wounded animal. Flame erupted through her belly, as if the ship screamed in agony. Kaga and Soryu followed within heartbeats, each carrier split open by explosions that melted steel into liquid fire and transformed imperial pride into drifting ash. 5 minutes erased Japan's seemingly unstoppable carrier force. 3 vessels that embodied empire now burned like funeral pyres. Men faced impossible choices between leaping into flaming seas or dying with their ships. The world's mightiest navy had just absorbed its most crushing defeat. Understanding this day of judgment requires stepping backward through months of hubris, plotting, and desperate wagers that led to Midway's shores. Pearl Harbor had ignited the Pacific War in smoke and flame. December 7, 1941, brought Japan's precision strike against American battleships. Sailors drowned in burning oil. Ships settled into harbor mud. America reeled from the blow. Tokyo's war planners celebrated what seemed like certain victory. The Pacific lay open for conquest. Beneath their triumph lurked a fatal assumption. Japan's commanders believed absolutely in Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the decisive battle concept. This philosophy grew from warrior traditions spanning centuries. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto preached its gospel relentlessly. One crushing engagement fought on Japanese terms would shatter enemy resolve permanently. Pearl Harbor was merely the opening move. Yamamoto's master plan involved drawing America into carefully prepared traps. Smaller operations would bleed them white. Then surviving enemy ships would sail straight into carrier ambushes. Early 1942 made victory appear inevitable. Japanese forces swept from Philippines to Singapore. Dutch East Indies fell. Burma collapsed. 4 carriers led this rampage. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu formed the mobile striking force. These ships rewrote naval warfare completely. Battleships no longer ruled the seas. Aircraft carriers became the new masters. Floating airfields whose reach extended across hundreds of miles. Steel dragons breathing fire from the sky. Victory bred dangerous overconfidence. Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the first carrier clash between Japan and America. Shokaku limped away heavily damaged. Zuikaku lost most of her air groups. Japanese forces retreated for the first time. Americans also suffered. Lexington burned and sank, but Japanese invincibility showed its first cracks. Yamamoto pressed forward anyway, his gaze fixed on Midway Atoll, tiny dots of coral and sand holding immense strategic value. American bombers from those runways could threaten Hawaii, could intercept supply convoys. Midway would serve as perfect bait. Capture it, and America would have no choice but to respond with everything remaining. Operation MI took shape in absolute secrecy. The plans sparkled with audacity. Launch diversionary attacks in the Aleutians, then seize Midway with overwhelming force. When the invasion fleet approached, Nagumo's carriers would annihilate whatever American ships appeared. Once America's carriers were destroyed, the Pacific would belong entirely to Japan. Strategy succeeds or fails on information flow. Here, Japan's greatest vulnerability emerged. American codebreakers at Station Hypo had penetrated Japanese naval communications. They knew Midway was the target. They understood the timing. They prepared their own deadly surprise. Admiral Nimitz gambled everything on one desperate throw. He concentrated his pitiful forces around 3 battered carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and wounded Yorktown. Though outnumbered and outgunned, they would wait in ambush north of Midway, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance. June 1942 brought 2 competing doctrines into collision. Japan trusted in decisive battle theory. America relied on intelligence, patience, and raw desperation. Midway would not be some minor skirmish. It would become the pivot point where arrogance met cunning and pride burned in flames. Long hours of preparation preceded the bombing. Crews trained endlessly. Engines roared during practice runs. Commanders weighed decisions that would determine the fate of nations. Understanding Midway means climbing aboard these steel giants. Japan's carrier force was not built overnight. It emerged from secrecy, ambition, and tons of welded steel. Each ship represented more than transportation. These were floating cities. Weapons platforms alive with thousands of warriors. Akagi stood as the crown jewel. Originally designed as a battle cruiser, the Washington Naval Treaty transformed her into an aircraft carrier. Her rising sun emblem stretched across the flight deck like a banner proclaiming destiny. She became Nagumo's flagship, a symbol of Japan's bold leap into carrier warfare. Kaga carried the weight of compromise. Once intended as a battleship, conversion left her heavy and broad. Thick armor plating provided resilience, but her design remained cluttered. Her decks stayed cramped. Crews called her temperamental. When her engines thundered, nothing could stop her. The smaller sisters followed. Soryu and Hiryu embodied Japan's pursuit of perfection. Sleek hulls cut through water efficiently. Fast engines drove them forward. Their air groups flew as deadly weapons. Pilots trained to fight as single units. Together, these 4 carriers formed the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon. At their heart flew the aircraft that made them invincible. Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were elegant death machines. Unmatched maneuverability and incredible range dominated skies from Manila to Darwin. Pilots climbing into these cockpits felt invincible. As if the machines carried the rising sun's spirit within their aluminum bones. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers added the hammer blow. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers provided the precision spear point. These aircraft had sunk battleships at Pearl Harbor, crippled cruisers across the Indian Ocean, humbled Western navies that had ruled seas for generations. Japan viewed these carriers as more than military tools. They embodied national pride, floating symbols of imperial destiny. Propaganda posters showed them as sea dragons. Their aircraft became flocks of hawks striking fear into distant shores. School children memorized their names. Newspapers praised their invincibility. Beneath the triumph, cracks were spreading. American industry was awakening. Essex-class carriers slid down shipyard ways, faster and larger than anything Japan could match. New aircraft designs entered testing phases. Most crucially, American pilots were learning hard lessons. Bloody encounters at Coral Sea and over Wake Island revealed zero weaknesses. Japanese tactical vulnerabilities became apparent. Still in spring 1942, the Kido Butai seemed untouchable. Men trained without rest. Flight crews practiced deck drills with clockwork precision. Moving bombs, torpedoes, fuel lines in deadly choreographed dances. Below decks, mechanics nursed engines with oil-stained hands. Pilots gathered in ready rooms memorizing attack patterns. Youth hidden beneath crisp uniforms. On Midway's eve, morale soared high. Officers raised toasts to certain victory. Pilots wrote final letters, folded neatly, to be mailed if they never returned. Battle was not merely duty to them. It was the path to immortality. Fate shows little mercy to pride. The very efficiency of Japan's carriers would doom them. Planes armed on deck, bombs and fuel stored hastily. These would transform the ships into floating powder magazines. Their confidence blinded them to closing traps. The rise of carriers had made Japan master of Pacific waters. But in warfare, what climbs fastest often falls hardest. The stage was prepared. The machines stood ready. The men believed destiny favored them. Now they would sail toward Midway, toward the day that would shatter everything they knew. Anticipation weighed heavy the night before Midway. Aboard Japanese carriers, engine hums and tool clanging echoed through steel corridors. Men moved with deadly purpose, yet tension flickered behind their eyes. Pilots bent over charts under pale lights, tracing attack routes with steady fingers. Mechanics checked fuel lines obsessively. Torpedoes and bombs received final inspections. A single error could trigger catastrophe. On Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo paced the flag bridge, cigarette glowing between his lips, his stare fixed on the dark horizon. He had guided the Kido Butai to Pearl Harbor glory. He had destroyed navies across Asia. Now he believed Midway would deliver the final stroke, the blow to crush America's will. Yet doubt gnawed beneath his calm exterior. Reports contradicted each other. Scouts had glimpsed shadows on the sea. Were American carriers truly absent? Or did they lurk nearby, waiting? Far across dark waters, aboard Enterprise and Hornet, different drama unfolded. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, new to carrier command, huddled with his staff in hushed conference. Intelligence reports confirmed Japan's target. His ships, battered and outnumbered, would not withdraw. Instead, they would spring the carefully prepared ambush. His pilots were young, many untested in combat, yet their determination burned bright. They understood they stood at history's hinge. On Yorktown, patched hastily after Coral Sea, welders worked by floodlight as she limped into position. Her decks bore battle scars. Her crew carried bone-deep exhaustion. But her fighting spirit remained unbroken. Sailors joked nervously, traded cigarettes, whispered desperate prayers. They knew the ship belonged in dry dock, Instead, she sailed toward Japanese jaws. Over Midway itself, Marines prepared for hell. Anti-aircraft guns stood manned. Trenches were dug deep. Sandbags stacked into protective walls. The men had watched Japanese planes roar overhead that morning. Bombs had torn fuel depots and hangars apart. They knew another wave approached. Some clutched rosaries. Others sharpened bayonets. All waited for dawn's light. At 5:34 a.m. on June 4th, waiting ended forever. A PBY Catalina patrol plane, circling endless seas, spotted dark shapes far below. The message crackled back immediately. Many enemy ships confirmed. It was the verification Admiral Nimitz had prayed for desperately. The Japanese had been found at last. Spruance acted with lightning speed. At 7:45, he issued critical orders. Launch immediately. Do not wait for coordination. Strike first. Strike hard. The sky above Enterprise and Hornet filled with aircraft. Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, Wildcats straining into morning air. They climbed toward the light, knowing many would never return. Back aboard Nagumo's fleet, chaos simmered dangerously. His strike group from Midway was returning, low on fuel, demanding immediate landing. Simultaneously, reports of American carriers nearby reached his ears. Torn between finishing Midway or preparing for fleet battle, he issued fateful commands. Rearm the planes, torpedoes off, bombs on. Then, moments later, bombs off, torpedoes on again. The decks became deadly mazes of weapons and fuel. The carriers that were Japan's pride transformed into floating tinderboxes. For the men, hours dragged like centuries. Pilots strapped into cockpits, sweat soaking through flight suits. Gunners cleaned weapons with trembling hands. Below deck, engineers stoked boilers frantically. Each engine throb carried them closer to destiny. On the horizon, first American squadrons appeared. They flew low and slow. Vulnerable as newborn birds, yet they came onward unwavering, straight into the gathering storm. The journey to Midway was over. The battle for Pacific dominance was about to explode. Morning sky above Midway thickened with battle smoke. At 9:20 a.m., the first American strike materialized on the horizon. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8. Launched from Hornet, they skimmed low across wave tops. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led the formation. The planes were slow machines, outdated and desperately vulnerable, yet they pressed forward relentlessly. As they approached, 30 Japanese Zeros swooped down like hunting falcons. The sky erupted in violent chaos. Machine gun fire stitched deadly patterns across the sea, tearing through fragile aluminum fuselages. Waldron's radio crackled one final order: attack regardless of consequences. Moments later, his plane burst into brilliant flames and spiraled into the ocean. One by one, Devastators were systematically shredded. Crews bailed out desperately. Parachutes blossomed briefly before being cut down by tracer fire. Fuel tanks exploded in orange fireballs. Wings sheared completely off. Engines screamed as they plummeted into the sea. Within minutes, Torpedo 8 was completely annihilated. All 15 planes destroyed utterly. Only one man survived the massacre: Ensign George Gay, bleeding and clinging to a seat cushion. He floated amidst the enemy fleet. From the water, he watched the battle rage above. But Waldron's sacrifice was not meaningless. The Zeros had been dragged low, chasing the doomed torpedo planes downward. Above them, the sky was suddenly clear and empty. At 9:30, a second wave arrived. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, led by Commander Eugene Lindsay. 14 more Devastators lumbering in formation. Once again, Japanese fighters swarmed like angry wasps. 10 were shot down within minutes. Smoke trails streaked across the waves. Lindsay's plane, riddled with bullet holes, staggered toward the target. Yet no torpedo found its mark. The survivors turned back, their comrades gone forever. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown dove into identical storms, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 12 more devastators. 6 Wildcats tried desperately to provide cover, but the Zeros cut through like razor-sharp knives. Massey himself pressed to within striking distance, releasing torpedoes under withering fire, none connected with targets. His plane disintegrated completely. 10 more crews perished. By 10 o'clock a.m., 41 torpedo bombers had attacked courageously. 35 were completely gone. Of 81 men, 69 were dead or dying. It appeared to be massacre without meaning, yet those men in their destruction had opened destiny's door. At 10:20, high above the chaos, another formation finally appeared. 37 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Commander C. Wade McCluskey, and 17 more from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. They had flown long searches desperately seeking the enemy. Low on fuel, pilots clenched their jaws, ready to ditch in the sea. Then McCluskey spotted a lone destroyer, Arashi racing to rejoin the fleet. He followed its foaming wake, and there, spread across blue infinity, lay Nagumo's carriers. The timing was absolutely perfect. The Zeros were low and out of position, the decks cluttered with bombs, torpedoes, refueling hoses. Japan's pride was naked, exposed, defenseless. At 10:26, McCluskey gave the signal. The Dauntlesses peeled into their dives. Engines screamed as they plummeted nearly vertically. Sunlight flashing off wings like mirrors. Bomb bay doors opened wide. On Kaga, sailors looked up to see dark shapes falling from heaven. Seconds later, a 1,000-pound bomb punched through the flight deck, detonating among fueled aircraft. Fire erupted instantly, spreading like wildfire through hangars packed with ordnance. A second bomb struck near the bridge, killing commanders instantly. A third ignited a gasoline truck. Flames engulfed the entire midsection. Within minutes, Kaga was a raging inferno, her crew trapped in steel compartments that became tombs. On Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai, chaos reigned supreme. A bomb from Lieutenant Richard Best struck squarely through the midship elevator. It detonated among loaded aircraft, setting off chain reactions of explosions. The blast hurled men into the air. Ignited aviation fuel shattered Nagumo's command center. Flames tore through hangar decks like hungry demons. Admiral Nagumo himself stumbled from the bridge, his flagship mortally wounded. On Soryu, Leslie's bombers descended with equal fury. Lieutenant Paul Holmberg dropped his bomb at just 3,000 feet. It ripped through the deck, detonating in the hangar, blasting an elevator into the bridge itself. A second bomb destroyed a Zero in the act of launching. A third exploded aft, consuming the ship in fire. Explosions cascaded bow to stern. Within 20 minutes, the carrier was a burning hulk. 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally struck: Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. In less than 5 minutes, the Empire's greatest weapon had been gutted completely. The sea itself seemed to pause in shock. Smoke rose in towering columns, black against the morning sun. Men leaped into burning water, their uniforms aflame. Others trapped below decks screamed unheard as steel warped and buckled around them. For those who survived the first blasts, horror only deepened further. Ammunition cooked off in chain reactions. Fuel lines burst wide, spraying fire across compartments. Bridges collapsed entirely. Bulkheads melted like wax. Decks caved inward. Sailors fought the infernos with buckets, with pumps, with bare bleeding hands. It was utterly useless. By 11 a.m., the battle was decided forever. Japan's strike force, once the terror of the Pacific, was crippled beyond any salvation. And yet, one carrier remained afloat. Soryu, concealed by cloud cover, had escaped destruction. Soon she would launch her own counterstrike, desperate to avenge her dying sisters. But for Nagumo, for the men of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the decisive moment had come and gone. The arrogance of victory had turned to bitter ash. The doctrine of decisive battle had betrayed them utterly. In the space of a single morning, the rising sun had begun its long descent. The smoke over Pacific waters thickened into a black funeral shroud. By noon, 3 carriers were dying giants: Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Their hulls burned fiercely. Their flight decks twisted and broken. The pride of the Imperial Navy had become floating coffins drifting on the tide. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to abandon ship. His flagship was finished completely. Yet Captain Taijiro Aoki refused to surrender her, lashing himself to a bulkhead. As flames engulfed the bridge, he chose to die with his command. Hours later, destroyers fired torpedoes into her hull, sending the shattered carrier beneath the waves. 263 of her crew went with her. Kaga fared no better than her sisters. Her armor kept her afloat for agonizing hours, but fire raged unchecked throughout. Bombs detonated deep inside her hangars, tearing men apart. At 7:25 p.m., Japanese destroyers scuttled her. 811 sailors had already perished. The survivors floated in oil-slick seas, clinging to debris, their eyes glazed with shock. Soryu, crippled by explosions that ripped through her engineering spaces, was abandoned as well. Captain Yanagimoto Ryusaku refused to leave. As his crew jumped into the sea, he remained on the bridge. At 7:13 p.m., she slipped beneath the waves, taking 718 souls with her. Thousands of men were dead. Japan's naval air arm was gutted completely. In a single morning, the Imperial Navy had lost more carriers than America had lost at Pearl Harbor. For survivors, the horror did not end with the sinking. Many clung to wreckage through the night, only to be swallowed by the sea. Sharks circled hungrily. Oil burned their skin raw. Some prayed to ancestors. Others simply closed their eyes, waiting for death to claim them. Aboard American carriers, the mood was grim yet resolute. Pilots returned to decks stained with fuel and blood, their squadrons decimated. Many aircraft never came back. Of 81 torpedo bomber crews, almost all were gone forever. Yet the dive bombers who landed, low on fuel and riddled with bullet holes, were hailed as heroes. They had achieved the impossible dream. In Pearl Harbor, radios crackled with stunning news. A stunned silence gave way to wild cheers. After months of retreat, America had struck a blow that echoed around the world. Newspapers would soon declare it the turning point of the Pacific. But the battle was not yet finished completely. Soryu, the last of Nagumo's carriers, remained afloat. That afternoon, her pilots launched desperate counterstrikes. Twice they struck Yorktown, crippling her with bombs and torpedoes. Sailors fought fires desperately, patched holes frantically, kept her afloat through sheer will. But Yorktown would not survive the week. Submarines would later finish her. Still, the price Japan paid was absolutely catastrophic. Not just in ships, not just in men, but in momentum itself. The empire had lost its deadly edge. The myth of invincibility was gone forever. For the men who watched the infernos at Midway, the images never left them. Flight decks collapsing, comrades trapped in steel, screams drowned by roaring fire. Survivors wrote in diaries of the day the ocean itself turned against us. By nightfall on June 4th, the Pacific was quiet again. But beneath its calm surface lay wrecks that once embodied the Empire's might. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, charred skeletons sinking into darkness. The cost was counted not only in numbers, but in the broken pride of a navy that believed itself unbeatable. And the world understood clearly. The tide of war had shifted forever. Midway was more than a battle. It was a reckoning written in fire and blood. In less than a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost what it could never replace: its elite carriers, its finest aviators, its aura of invincibility. For Japan, it was a wound that bled for the rest of the war. The losses at Pearl Harbor had been material. Battleships could be rebuilt. But at Midway, the loss was strategic, psychological, and irreversible. 4 carriers, half of Japan's striking power, were gone forever. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots perished in the flames. Training new crews would take years. Time Japan did not possess. For the United States, the victory was a miracle of intelligence, courage, and perfect timing. Codebreakers at Station Hypo had pierced the enemy's communications, giving Admiral Nimitz the knowledge to set his trap. Pilots flying outdated aircraft had pressed on against impossible odds, sacrificing their lives so that others might strike the final blow. The devastators that fell in flames had cleared the skies for the dauntlesses that changed history forever. Strategically, Midway shifted the balance of power permanently. No longer was Japan on the offensive. From June 1942 onward, the Empire would fight a defensive war, retreating step by step across the Pacific. America, fueled by industry and resilience, seized the initiative. The long road to Tokyo began not at Pearl Harbor, but at Midway. Yet beyond strategy, the battle left something deeper, a lesson carved into memory. Arrogance can blind completely. Doctrine can betray utterly. Machines of steel can crumble in minutes. In the end, war belongs not to the invincible, but to those who adapt, endure, and seize the fleeting moment. For the men who lived it, Midway was unforgettable. Survivors on both sides carried scars invisible to history books. American pilots recalled the faces of comrades who never returned. Japanese sailors remembered flames that consumed their ships and the silence that followed. Today, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest on the ocean floor. Silent graves in the deep. They are monuments not just to defeat, but to the fragility of power itself. Midway's legacy endures because it asked a timeless question. How can the tide of war turn in mere minutes? The answer lies not in steel or fire alone, but in chance, in courage, and in the human will to fight when hope seems lost. June 4, 1942, was the day the rising sun dimmed, and the world discovered that even empires can burn.